We could almost see Ted Lavender's dreamy blue eyes. We could almost hear him. "Roger that," somebody said. "I'm ready to fly." There was the sound of the wind, the sound of birds, and the quiet afternoon, which was the world we were in. That's what a story does. The bodies are animated. You make the dead talk. That they sometimes say things like "Roger that," or they say "Timmy, stop crying," which is what Linda said to me after she was dead. Even now I can see her walking down the aisle of the old State Theater in Worthington, Minnesota. I can see her face in profile beside me, the cheeks softly lighted by coming attractions. The movie that night was The Man Who Never Was. I remember the plot clearly, or at least the promise, because the main character was a corpse. The fact alone, I know, deeply impressed me. It was a World War II film. The Allies devised a scheme to mislead Germany about the site of the upcoming landings in Europe. They get their hands on a body, a British soldier, I believe. They dress him up in an officer's uniform, plant fake documents in his pockets, then dump him in the sea and let the currents wash him onto a Nazi beach. The Germans find the documents, the deception wins the war. Even now I can remember the awful splash as the corpse fell into the sea. I remember glancing over at Linda, thinking it might be too much for her, but in the dim gray light she seemed to be smiling at the screen. There were little crinkles in her eyes, her lips open and gently curving at the corners. I couldn't understand it. There was nothing to smile at. Once or twice, in fact, I had to close my eyes, but it didn't help me much. Even then I could see the soldier's body tumbling toward the water, splashing down hard, how inert and heavy it was, how completely dead. It was a relief when the movie finally ended. Afterwards we drove out to the Dairy Queen at the edge of town. The night had quilted, weighted down quality, as if somehow burdened, and all around us Minnesota's prairies reached out in a long repetitive waves of corn and soybeans. Everything flat, everything the same. I remember eating ice cream in the back seat of the Buick and a long blank drive in the dark, and then pulling up in front of Linda's house. Things must have been said, but it's all gone now, except for a few last images. I remember walking her to the front door. I remember the brass porch light with its fierce yellow glow, my own feet, the juniper bushes along the front steps, the wet grass, Linda close beside me. We were in love, 9 years old, yes, but it was really real love. And now we were alone on those front steps. Finally we looked at each other. "Bye," I said. Linda nodded and said bye. Over the next few weeks, Linda wore her new red cap to school every day. She never took it off, not even in the classroom, and so it was inevitable that she took some teasing about it. Most of it came from a kid named Nick Veenhoff. Out on the playground during recess, Nick would creep up behind her and make a grab for the cap, almost yanking it off, then scampering away. It went on like that for weeks, the girls giggling, the guys egging him on. Naturally, I wanted to do something about it, but it just wasn't possible. I had my own reputation to think about. I had my pride, and there was also the problem of Nick Veenhoff, so I stood off to the side just a spectator, wishing I could do things I couldn't do. I watched Linda clamp down the hat with the palm of her hand, holding it there, smiling over in Nick's direction as if none of it really mattered. For me, though, it did matter. It still does. I should have stepped in. 4th grade is no excuse. Besides, it doesn't get easier with time. And 12 years later, when Vietnam presented much harder choices, some practice at being brave might have helped a little. Also, too, I might have stopped what happened next. Maybe not, but at least it's possible. Most of the details I've forgotten or maybe blacked out, but I know it was an afternoon in the late spring, and we were taking a spelling test. And halfway into it, Nick Veenhoff held up his hand and asked to use a pencil sharpener. Right away the kids laughed. No doubt he'd broken the pencil on purpose, but it wasn't something you could prove. And so the teacher nodded and told him to hustle it up, which was a mistake. Out of nowhere, Nick developed a terrible limp. He moved in slow motion, dragging himself up to the pencil sharpener and carefully slipping in his pencil, and then grinding away forever. At the time, I suppose it was funny, but on the way back to his seat, Nick took a short detour. He squeezed between two desks, turned sharply right, and moved up the aisle toward Linda. I saw him grin at one of his pals. In a way, I already knew what was coming. As he passed Linda's desk, he dropped the pencil and squatted down to get it. When he came up, his left hand slipped behind her back. There was a half-second hesitation. Maybe he was trying to stop himself. Maybe then, just briefly, he felt some small approximation of guilt. But it wasn't enough. He took hold of the white tassel, stood up, and gently lifted off her cap. Somebody must have laughed. I remember a short, tinny echo. I remember Nick Veenhoff trying to smile. Somewhere behind me a girl said, or a sound like that. Linda didn't move. Even now, when I think back on it, I can still see the glossy whiteness of her scalp. She wasn't bald, not quite, not completely. There were some tufts of hair, little patches of grayish-brown fuzz, but what I saw then, and kept seeing now, is all that whiteness, a smooth, pale, translucent white. I could not see the bones. I could see the bones and veins. I could see the exact structure of her skull. There was a large band-aid at the back of her head, a row of black stitches, a piece of gauze taped above her left ear. Nick Veenhoff took a step backward. He was still smiling, but the smile was doing strange things. The whole time Linda stared straight ahead, her eyes locked on the blackboard, her hands loosely folded at her lap. She didn't say anything. After a time, though, she turned and looked at me across the room. It lasted only a moment, but I had the feeling that a whole conversation was happening between us. Well, she was saying, and I was saying, sure, okay. Later on, she cried for a while. The teacher helped her put the cap back on. Then we finished the spelling test and did some finger painting. And after school that day, Nick Veenhoff and I walked her home. It's now 1990. I'm 43 years old, which would have seemed impossible to a fourth grader. And yet when I look at photographs of myself as I was in 1956, I realize that in the important ways I haven't changed at all. I was Timmy then, and now I'm Tim. But the essence remains the same. I'm not fooled by the baggy pants or the crew cut or the happy smile. I know my own eyes, and there is no doubt that the Timmy smiling at the camera is the Tim I am now. Inside the body or beyond the body, there is nothing absolute and unchanging. The human life is all one thing, like a blade tracing loops on ice. A little kid, a 23-year-old infantry sergeant, a middle-aged writer knowing guilt and sorrow. And as a writer now, I want to save Linda's life. Not her body, her life. She died, of course, 9 years old, and she died. It was a brain tumor. She lived through the summer and into the first part of September, and then she was dead. But in a story, I can steal her soul. I can revive, at least briefly, that which is absolute and unchanging. In a story, miracles can happen. Linda can smile and sit up. She can reach out, touch my wrist, and say, "Timmy, stop crying." I needed that kind of miracle. At some point, I had come to understand that Linda was sick, maybe even dying, but I loved her and just couldn't accept it. In the middle of the summer, I remember my mother tried to explain to me about brain tumors. Now and then, she said, bad things start growing inside us. Sometimes you can cut them out, and other times you can't. And for Linda, it was one of the times when you can't. I thought about it for several days. All right, I finally said. So, will she get better now? Well, no, my mother said. I don't think so. She stared at the spot behind my shoulder. Sometimes people don't even get better. They die sometimes. Not Linda, I said. But on a September afternoon during noon recess, Nick Veenhoff came up to me on the school playground. Your girlfriend, he said. She kicked the bucket. At first I didn't understand. She's dead, he said. My mom told me at lunchtime. No lie, she actually kicked the god-dang bucket. All I could do was nod. Somehow it didn't quite register. I turned away, glanced down at my hands for a second, and then walked home without telling anyone. It was a little after 1 o'clock, I remember, and the house was empty. I drank some chocolate milk and then lay down on the sofa in the living room, not really sad, just floating, trying to imagine what it was to be dead. Nothing much came to me. I remember closing my eyes and whispering her name, almost begging, trying to make her come back. Linda, I said, please, and then I concentrated. I willed her alive. It was a dream, I suppose, or a daydream, but I made it happen. I saw her coming down the middle of the main street, all alone. It was nearly dark, and the street was deserted, no cars or people, and Linda wore a pink dress and shiny black shoes. I remember sitting down on the curb to watch. All her hair had grown back. The scars and stitches were gone. In the dream, if that's what it was, she was playing a game of some sort, laughing and running up the empty street, kicking a big aluminum water bucket. Right then I started to cry. After a moment, Linda stopped and carried her water bucket over to the curb and asked why I was so sad. Well, God, I said, you're dead. Linda nodded at me. She was standing under a yellow streetlight, a 9-year-old girl, just a kid, and yet there was something ageless in her eyes. Not a child, not an adult, just a bright, ongoing everness, the same pinprick of absolute lasting light that I see today in my own eyes as Timmy smiles at Tim from the graying photographs of that time. Dead, I said. Linda smiled. It was a secret smile, as if she knew that things nobody could ever know, and she reached out and touched my wrist and said, Timmy, stop crying. It doesn't matter.